And we are live. And we were with Dr. Wilfred, is it Wilfred Reilly?
I usually just go with Will, but yeah, my full name is Wilfred Reilly. Yeah.
Excellent. And you are a professor at Kentucky State, I believe.
Yeah, I'm an associate professor of political science at KSU right now. I got tenure about a year ago.
Now, I understand you have a law degree too.
Yeah, although the joking dinner party line is I'm a nice guy despite that. But yeah, I went to Illinois for law school prior to Southern Illinois University for my PhD. I'd gotten out of law school, and being a young lawyer without complaining about anything white collar is a famously depressing job. Like, you're the guy sleeping on a cot in the office doing paperwork 12, 13 hours a day. So I was contacted by a program called Diversifying the Faculty of Illinois that wanted to get more African Americans and more males into higher education, either at the collegiate or that secondary level. And they basically asked me if I wanted to get a PhD for free, if I'd be willing to do some teaching or maybe a little coaching. And I said, yeah. So I went down to Southern. I ended up getting the PhD in politics. So I've never really, I mean, I've taken bar exams, but I've never really been a practicing lawyer in any state.
Okay, well, that's cool. I have a lot of lawyers on, but I also found one thing, that lawyer seems to be one of those fields where everybody's trying to get out of it as soon as they're in. They want to be an author, or, well, I have YouTube lawyer friends now.
Yeah. Well, that's because it's such a miserable job. And again, any honest work you can get is fine, whatever. But I mean, if you actually think about law, most people have this sort of Masonic image of you going into a courtroom and you're probably either prosecution or defense. Sure. Your client actually deserves the outcome they're going to get. That's not really what happens. So, I mean, I trained as a fairly high-end criminal lawyer. My background was white-collar criminal prosecution. But what actually would happen if you're working that would lead to like a big city prosecutor's office. You're going to be handed 200 files, and your boss is going to say something like, I want 192 of these asses in jail. And you're going to work 10 hours a day cutting deals with defense lawyers. And I mean, in the corporate side, it's even more boring. I mean, you're reading contracts, you're auditing firms, you're doing that kind of thing. The majority of lawyers never see the interior of a courthouse, at least a criminal courthouse, a major courthouse, federal, anything like that. So a lot of lawyers are just a guy in an office who's thinking, I went to law school because I wanted to help the poor, or whatever that might have been. And here I am working for Deloitte. Please God, let me do anything else. So a lot of them do leave to become like gentleman farmers and shit, like jobs you would never think of.
Anything. I want to use my hands. I don't want to use my brain. And I have been told that I've gotten jury duty called for both the state, obviously, and then for federal. And everybody warned me. They're like, oh God, pray you don't get the federal. Pray you don't get called, because then if it's white collar, that would be the most painful case you can sit through imaginable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's like I don't have a lot of sympathy for white collar crime, because once we accept the idea that we're going to have laws and not just let people fight for dominance, which I might have disliked as a younger man, but now seems like the way to go. I mean, you have to obey them. So even if they are complex rich guy laws, it's stupid that you can't have a small bag of marijuana too. Like, if you break the law, obviously charges should be brought. But if you actually watch one of these white collar cases, I mean, it's just the most ridiculous stuff. Like, were you informed that you should sell a certain security within 10 days of that company releasing its most recent financial disclosure statement by someone who is in a position to know about the impending success of the company? And like, I remember a friend of mine quoting Chris Rock, a guy named John Chief, let's call him, who just looked at a law book, and we were both in law school. I was like, I didn't even know any of this bullshit was crimes. And it is that kind of stuff. So, like the Enron case, if you're familiar with that case, what they did was create what we would call Star Trek cutouts in elite business at the time. Mm-hmm. Like, they would have their executives set up these firms that was just like the executive and his daughter is CFO and so on. Mm-hmm. And they would technically sell a worthless piece of property, like an oil well that had run dry, to this firm, because then it's a sale to an outside firm that establishes valuation. And the firm, called Death Star Mobile, or whatever ridiculous name they made up, would hold on to this piece of junk for a year and then sell it back for twice as much. And eventually, in addition to their energy hustling, what they were doing was controlling this worthless land that was valued, or these depleted energy resources that were valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, but then in fact had no value at all. And that's a pretty typical white collar crime. But to prosecute that, you'd have to look through everything that, Death Star Holdings technically owned, and you'd have to have surveyors go look at it. I mean, you're in good luck that you never got seated for a federal civil case. That's like a month of your life just for not much.
Yeah, that's what I heard, because they have to spend all the time proving that whole paper trail, and it's excruciating, not to mention every bit of draconian accounting that happens to be there, and how this accounting works or shouldn't work. And anyway.
Yeah. Well, just very quickly, I mean, yeah, there are also all these accounting tricks. Now, I'm no longer varsity at any of this. I'm out of the business world. I'm in the academic world. But I mean, 10 years ago when I was there, the big hoss was mark to market, where when you went to market with creditors and they asked you about the value of your assets, what do you have for collateral, you could estimate the value of certain things not as what it was, which could be almost worthless, but as what it might be down the road. What would your house be worth when it was fully completed, so on. So, I mean, to really pursue one of these cases, you have to look not just at whether people are telling the truth about the assets they have, but how they were valuing that class of assets. And there are like 25 ways to do this. So unless you are some kind of federal regulator, IQ 150 plus, if you're looking at this stuff, it's just like the classic idea of gibberish. The writings of Al Jaybirds is nonsense on a page you can't read. I can still read it, but I mean, I thank God I don't have to. And that's why a lot of people get out of the law. It's just, and a lot of the stuff is written in Latin also, like the words are in Latin, and then there's this mathematical nonsense. So this is, the comment is exactly correct. It makes it easier for members of the elite to get away with things. It's the same thing with writing congressional bills. But a lot of people decide ethically and just in terms of fun, they don't want to do that, and they get the hell out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. So let's go ahead and talk about something that's equally dirty, but a lot more fun. Hate crime hoaxes.
Woo! Okay.
Now, from what I understand, you got involved in or kind of caught up in a hate crime hoax early on, and that's what sort of led you down this path.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, so I lean kind of center-right politically, but as I mentioned, with the legal background and interest in prosecution, I've actually always been pretty sympathetic to the victims of crimes, and I've always followed crime stories. So the reason I became interested in hate crime hoaxes was that during a period, and this is years later, so I might get some of the dates wrong, but say 2012 to 2014, there were a number of these cases in kind of the Chicago student community, which I was sort of a member in good standing of. There was a bar in Chicago, actually in the inner suburbs, called Velvet Ultra Lounge, which was a very hipster urban student bar, like ferns all over the place. It had at least a 50% gay clientele. My ex used to like dance.
Never.
But I mean, my ex used to like dancing there because gay guys don't obnoxiously hit on you all the time. But just nice club, student club. I mean, this bar was burned to the ground. And again, Velvet Rope Ultra Lounge. And throughout this place, there were spray painted this horrific anti-gay graffiti. I mean, the paper described it as, 3 and 4 letter anti-gay slurs, but windows broken out. The place, as I recall, most of it was set on fire, burned nearly to the ground. So there was this incident. And within a year or so of this, there was a situation at the University of Chicago where a student named Derek Kakaline claimed that an entire group of conservative hackers had taken over his social media and had, using the message function on his own Facebook page, posted rape and murder threats to him. And again, that was a front page story in the Trib. I think it made the Journal. I mean, it was a major national story. And around this same time, this one actually might have come first, the most extreme of these. There was a situation at the University of Wisconsin Parkside, which is a very nice mid-sized college where I once applied for an academic job, where a list of death threats was made up, as I recall, photocopied multiple times, and placed around campus that included the names of most of the Black students in the campus community. I mean, a pretty good number of people, and said something like marked for death. At the same time, there were a couple of nooses found on that campus. So within this very short period of time, and there was another case at Michigan Tech that we don't even need to get into, but within a very short period of time, there were all of these alleged high-profile hate crimes in that single Chicago kind of grad student community. And long story short, I subscribed to the Tribune at the time, and I kept up with them. And within the course of perhaps a year, every one of these cases had been debunked. And Wisconsin Parkside, one of the nooses turned out just to be something like a string of rubber bands, which is surprisingly common, by the way, if you follow through these kind of situations.
Yeah, but the race car, the NASCAR driver, Bubba, whatever, right?
Wallace,
didn't he have a similar noose situation?
Yeah, well, Bubba Wallace was a guy who claimed that a hangman's noose had been placed in his NASCAR garage, and that must be targeting him as a black driver. Now, it turns out there are only so many ways to tie a rope. One of which is, the Boy Scout hangman's cross hitch, and someone tied the pull rope for the garage in that fashion. And
like 2 years before he got there or something.
Yeah, because they change garages every race, so you can't cheat. There were like all of these things. I don't think he intentionally hoaxed it, but I'm pretty sure his crew chief was like, hey, let's get some media out of this one because it's a new garage. The rope looks like a rope. I mean, that's what a noose is. It's a knot in the end of a rope. So like every gee rope at a construction site, if you had a blue collar job, looks like a noose. So there were many things that should have indicated that that was a complete false flag situation. But yeah, that was similar. But at Wisconsin Parkside, I mean, the same thing. The nooses were not real, as I understand. But more importantly, the list of black students had been put together by another black student who was sort of a campus activist. She apparently didn't think that the college was taking, the other racial incident seriously enough. And she was eventually caught because she spelled the name of everyone on the list but herself wrong. There were apparently some fairly exotic names, quote unquote. She just didn't know everybody. So again, I mean, this massive use of state police, if not FBI resources, that's what turned out there.
Derek, is that the one that you mentioned that she was trying to get more attention to the other incident, and it turned out the other incident itself was a hoax as well?
Well, there were like 7 of those, actually. I mean, the most dramatic of those was where a woman slashed herself in the face with like a hat pin or a small knife to call attention to a previous incident where a Muslim student claimed that white fraternity guys had tried to set her on fire. This was at Michigan. And both incidents turned out to be pretty flamboyant fakes. And as I recall, charges were filed in both of them. This stuff, now, obviously, I want to say, again, I'm still sympathetic to the victims of crime. So if someone says, I got my ass kicked for racial reasons outside a cowboy bar at closing time, or like a tough black club, like that probably happened. You need to put officers on that. But within the campus community, where a tiny percentage of Americans are currently resident at any given time. I mean, if you assume that there are 2 million college students total, that's a little more than half of 1% of the population. You see an enormous number of these incidents. I mean, if you, in addition to putting together my own data set, I fact checked it against, www.fakehatecrime.org, like portals set up by previous researchers in this field. And I will say on fake hate crimes, FHC, of the first 200 featured cases they have, I think it was 89 of them took place on a college, university, or senior high school campus. So almost half of these cases take place where you have half of 1% of the people. And these tend to be, those figures might be a little bit off.
Is that just the need for drama?
Well, I think that sure. I mean, just as youth are known for, publicly hooking up unprotected in libraries. I mean, there's an element of being young to this. But I also think, I'm sorry?
An adventure, like kind of I mean, rather than just saying, I got my assignment late, something terrible happened to me. Seems to be rewarded now.
And I mean, I'm not going to name any names, but as a college professor, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the cause of some of it. Like, why is your test late, which could prevent you from graduating and, joining the military as an officer? 5 black guys beat me up. I mean, it's a combination of some fairly serious things being online, being very immature. But another element of this is the hothouse environment on these college campuses, where, I mean, very frequently, some of the larger majors on campus would be, African American studies, which can do some good, but the extensions of that post-colonial women's, et cetera, studies, beyond that to things like sociology taught from a radical perspective. There's a lot of conversation about oppression and white privilege and cultural appropriation and all of this, the brutal oppression of business women in the 21st century that you're going to hear. And so you're going to think that this stuff is ever present. And you might be tempted to come up with an incident to illustrate that, you know, Duquesne or whatever campus, Oberlin would actually be a better example where this happened, is not free of this kind of thing. I mean, on the Oberlin College campus, there were actually multiple claimed incidents of this kind that almost all turned out to be fakes. Someone spotted the Klansman, a Klansman on campus. It turned out to be, as I recall, someone leaving a one-night hookup that put a sheet over themselves in kind of mocking shame. There was a claim that a local business was discriminating against students by physically attacking them when they tried to go there and shop. It turned out that the students were pretty well-known thieves and had a backpack filled with bottles of wine at the time. But I mean, without beating this to death, I think that college campuses tend to be a very left-wing environment where there's a lot of discussion of oppression and conflict, and that contributes to this. I mean, people might actually start wondering, why hasn't that happened here? Or there might be an attempt to mobilize a campus against real but really subtle racism by invoking something like this. But I mean, getting back to these Chicago stories for 30 seconds or so, I mean, Kakaline, again, there was a basic IP address trace done by the feds. This is another one where the FBI got involved. And he turned out to have essentially just messaged himself. All of the messages, he didn't use Tor or a VPN or anything. This guy wasn't all that computer savvy. The messages all just came from his room and went to his room. I mean, he had an individual router, so it wasn't that hard to figure out what was going on. And the Velvet Rope Ultra Lounge case was presented as accurate for a while. It actually caused some reforms in Chicago policing. But a year or plus down the road, a friend of this guy got in trouble for a DUI and basically just spilled the whole thing to the arresting officers. And the insurance boys got involved and the police got involved. And it turned out that in Chicago, it's not always a good idea to owe money to people in the nightlife business. He apparently was about $200,000 in debt and had just set his venue on fire. And as I recall, he ended up doing about 2 years in jail, 2 years in prison. So the first three cases that I looked at that were very high profile, Midwestern, you know, young upper middle class people saying this stuff turned out to be fakes. And that kind of prompted the question, well, how often does that happen? I mean, we keep hearing about these very flamboyant cases in the media. Tawana Brawley had already happened. Duke Lacrosse had already happened. Are these real? Or is this, you know, for example, an aggrieved ex-boyfriend or something like that?
Sure.
So, yeah, I basically said that when I had a sabbatical and I had a summer spare, I would do a couple months of research on this and see how many of these fakes I could find. And I did it, and the number is roughly 1,000 right now. I mean, the original hate crime hoax data set, which is fully available if you email me, has grown. It's more than 600 case studies, and some of those involve multiple fakes.
Is it slowing at all?
No, pace is pretty consistent. I mean, if you look at the
was there a period of time that this started? I mean, has it always existed, or has it like ramped up over time?
Well, that's something where, as a pretty solid quantitative methodologist, I mean, I want to be careful. It looks like it's ramped up dramatically recently, but that could just be because it's harder to find newspaper or microfiche stories. I mean, proven confirmation of a case from the 80s or something like that. But of the probably, I'm going to actually pull up some notes here, just being honest, but like of the very high profile, widely publicized hate crime incidents over the past couple of years, say 2 or 3 years, almost all of them, unless you're talking about something like a mass shooting, have turned out to be fakes. I mean, where you've got Jussie Smollett, you've got Bubba Wallace, the guy who found a rope in his garage, the pull rope for the garage.
How about the cop? There's a cop who wrote pig on his own cup. And then there was another cop that legitimately had pig written on their cup at Starbucks.
Yeah, that's another one. I mean, so yeah, it's important to talk about these from the right as well. I mean, there have been a couple of these incidents. I believe I only listed one of the two as a hoax. As you mentioned,
that's what I'm saying. The one cop apparently was legitimate, and it looks like somebody at Starbucks wrote pig on it, got fired, and then the other cop saw that and said, "Oh, somebody wrote pig on my cup." I could be wrong. I'd have to check the timeline, but
May as well get these free coffees for a year. Yeah, I mean that basic idea of being noticed, one, and of receiving some kind of reward, two. So we often see this with a business. I mean, those are obviously two of the independent variables that would motivate people to do this. But I mean, there were a couple of these, right? Like there were a couple of officers, I think female officers, that said someone put a dirty tampon in their coffee at Starbucks, and it turned out that something like a residual napkin had gotten into the drink. I don't think I counted that as a hoax, but there's definitely been a dialogue around this stuff now, to the point where if someone says
That's a good question. Actually, when you said you didn't count that as a hoax, and sorry to interrupt, but we had talked about another one in the past about the dog poop that was left outside of what was it, a black student center or something like that. And it turned out that it had nothing to do with anything. What differentiates a hoax? Like, I'm going to just call Jussie Smollett a hoax, since he did get charged. I think the public would agree with it. An intentional act that's saying something, or in the case of Bubba Wallace, that's not necessarily a hoax, but some being mistaken about something. Do you differentiate at all?
Well, there is a definition, and again, all this is fairly controversial in academia and any kind of I've been asked questions about it. I wrote an article recently for the National Association of Scholars Journal, sort of breaking this down. The original definition of a hoax used in hate crime hoax was pretty broad, because I wanted to bring in a lot of these internationally prominent stories, and I think we were successful in doing that. But it was a nationally or internationally reported serious incident, too. Generally, the majority of them were felony or misdemeanor crimes. There are also some things that could have led to permanent expulsion from college or permanent firing from a job. So, major report of a serious incident that was essentially universally attributed to bias. I mean, so that's the only element of the definition that's really broad enough to be debatable at all. But that was attributed to bias. The media, for example, was a potential attributor. The alleged victim was a potential attributor, and the police. Those were really the only kind of entities that I accepted as being able to categorize it. And in most cases, there was virtually 100% overlap between those categories, i.e., something would happen, and whether or not they got to the point of filing a formal hate report, the police would say, initially, this looks like a hate crime. The person would say, this is a hate crime against me, and the media would present it that way. The only exceptional cases there would be situations where there wasn't an immediate alleged victim, if that makes sense. So, for example, there were a number of cases where nooses were found hanging from trees on college campuses, and the press on the campus and the police said, this appears to be a hate incident. And it later turned out that the noose was a rope left over from a construction site. So that would be, I would count that as a quote unquote hoax. That would go in the book. I've heard some coherent arguments that some of these might better be called hate crime collapses or hate crime narrative collapses. So, I mean, I would consider the phrase hoaxes and collapses for the hate crime data sheet. But like, for example, the dog poop thing is in there because that became a story. That story was reprinted in Singapore. I mean, you're talking about the incident where a young disabled woman was walking across campus and her dog did what dogs do. And she had been told to leave these little bags of crap, basically, on the ledges where people would be able to dispose of them, or the rims.
She wouldn't know where the trash can necessarily was. She was blind.
Yeah. There's an easy joke here, but I'm way too tasteful to make it. But I mean, you couldn't see. But anyway, and obviously it's not at the expense of blind people. Anyway, the point is that she left this stuff on the front porch of the African American Student Center.
And you could obviously read and say, oh, this would be a bad building to, same way that she couldn't pick out a garbage can. She couldn't say, oh, if I leave it here, people might get annoyed.
Yeah. And so, I mean, campus police opened an investigation. Yeah, this was at least 2 out of 3. Campus police opened an investigation into this as a potential hate incident. The student body became outraged. Media reported on this. And it eventually turned out that this disabled woman had meant no disrespect to black people. She had just put this bag on the first ledge she came across. And by the way, I don't see why it would be any more offensive to do that there than to do that anywhere else. I mean, I don't see why the janitors in that building would be more reluctant to throw it away or something.
Oh, yeah.
But so what happened then, and this to me is my all-time favorite modern college environment story, probably out of all these. But after this was revealed, student activists, then they stopped protesting the campus for racism, and they began to protest it for being inaccessible to the disabled. And there were a series of pro-disability reforms that are apparently going on there. But I mean,
I love that. It's always nice to have the outrage searching for a controversy.
That's an excellent description. The outrage searching for a controversy, and you see this all the time. Like, I keep an eye. I actually read. I mean, the sort of mainstream center left stuff as well. I mean, the Chronicle of Higher Education and so on. But I definitely keep an eye on the heterodox campus press. And I was reading Campus Reform today. And one of their articles just had a great, if dark, title. It was like, multiple false sexual assault accusations prompt diversity outreach campaign. It was a couple of professors got accused of sexual harassment of students. It apparently was pretty baseless. But as they were investigating these professors, they noticed there were a lot of white men in that department. And now there's a campaign to diversify the faculty. So there's always going to be. And this is actually, by the way, a technique Abby Hoffman advocated for both the left and the radical right? Like, have constant, intense anger, have a set of things that you want. And when someone proves you wrong on one point, just immediately leapfrog, hopscotch over to the other point and start talking about that. And you see this.
Alinsky plays in that area too, doesn't he?
Saul Alinsky is the OG that Hoffman probably read, actually. I mean, but yeah. So you see this a lot debating Black Lives Matter, which I'm a black man, I have respect for the community, one, but also two, I think a lot of the stuff they say is BS. So between those two, I'm in a lot of sort of men's forums where this is being discussed. And I mean, their whole argument is goalpost moving to some extent, not to get totally off track here, but the first claim was, there are thousands, if you look at their original website or claims from people like Cherno Biko, of unarmed brothers getting killed by cops every year. And it turns out that everyone from me to the Washington Post looked at that and they're like 10 every year. So the next claim was, well, are the armed people, really, was it necessary to kill them? And we're not just talking about death. That's a guy named Roland Fryer demonstrated that across a bunch of situations, conflict, non-conflict, sort of regular working class white guys are actually much more likely to get shot than black guys. It was 24% or more more likely to get shot, probably because there's no movement actively protesting that might attack officers. But so, I mean, when I bring that up now, you've gone through points 1 and 2, the argument changes to, well, we're not just talking about fatal violence. Who are the police more disrespectful to?
Harassment.
So you have to write another paper.
Black and things like that, which I've heard. I actually had Dr. Michael Wood on last night.
Okay.
And he's all about police reform. Okay. But some of this has come up with him, and you're right on that about whites being, shot in large numbers as well. And part of the problem is that only one is being addressed. We might agree that maybe there's too much violence going on universally, and if that's the case, everybody could get on board and say, well, let's look at what's causing more violence, but everything becomes racialized.
Yeah, the thing that's remarkable about Black Lives Matter is that there's no evidence that if you do just the most basic things like adjusting for class or prior record, black people are more likely to get shot than anyone else. I mean, if you go to the Washington Post Fatal Force database, because numbers are good. I mean, this is just undisputed center left, excellent data. I've looked at it, reviewed it, although not officially. I mean, but the total number of people shot by the police in a typical year is about 1,000. Of those, generally about 25% are identified as African American. Black people make up 14% of the population, so that's in just pure decimal terms, a 0.11, 11% overrepresentation. It's more than that, of course, if you're comparing 14 and 25.
Sure.
But I mean, the response even there is, well, the black crime rate is also higher than the Caucasian crime rate. For violent crimes, whites dominate corporate crime, but for violent crimes, it's about 2 to 1. So if you just adjust for crime rate before even the things that I said, the gaps go away, and they're tiny in the first place. You're talking a bit over 20% for a group that's a bit over 10% of the country. So there's not even necessarily an argument here. And this actually comes up pretty often with African-American radicals that I'm friendly with. You'll see these claims like only 14% of Emmy-winning actresses are Black. And you just have to kind of say, well, only 14% of people are Black, my brother. And it's something that I don't think, because a lot of African Americans live in African American communities, and because everyone tends to kind of front face their own race and group,
Sure.
I don't think it's something people even think of. But of course, 14% of the people are going to be 10 to 16% of the award winner. That's not a problem. So that's my reaction to a lot of this stuff. Like, you wouldn't expect, and this comes up all the time. I mean, whites are 60% of the people in this category. Whites are 70% of the U.S. population. So that's
they're underrepresented technically.
Oh, that's another way. Nah, that's how the white guys can come at it now. But no, these are just almost bullshit statistical aberrations. If you're talking about whites are 69%, they make up 63% one year. If you've ever done a coin flip test in a math class, nothing's ever going. Well, this is actually a pretty deep line, if unintentionally. Nothing's ever going to be mathematically perfect. And if your intent is to be a bigot, Black or white, that's always going to give you ammunition. But it's important for people that aren't bigots to say, well, no, that's nonsense. That's 1/3 of a standard deviation away in either direction. That's not a thing. And that's my reaction to a lot of Black Lives Matter. That's not a thing. You know, if 10 Black guys and 50 white guys are killed by the police while unarmed every year, you can say that our tiny number is disproportionate, but it's worth noting that getting that down to 8 would make it proportionate. So there are a lot of reasons these movements receive so much support, and that's not because they're factual bases.
Right. Now, are we starting to segue into your second book now as we're talking about this? I mean, taboo, things that we can't talk about. I mean, technically you can't talk about this, right?
Well, we can go back and forth between the titles if you want, but yeah, taboo. So hate crime hoax, essentially kind of getting into really actually what I was just about to say before we started really having a conversation there. I mean, about methods, what the definitions were. The original point behind hate crime hoax was just, I saw these 3 major cases collapse very rapidly. And I asked, what's the percentage chance of that? I ended up writing the book. But what I find, although, again, the majority of accusations of low-level felony ass whippings and so on across racial lines are probably real. We should be sympathetic to crime victims. But most of the very high-profile, kind of widely publicized incidents in the past 4 years have turned out to be hoaxes. If you're looking at Brother Juicy Smollett. But to do
Dave
some...
Chappelle is a hero.
Dave Chappelle is a great man. But... But I mean, like Erica Thomas was another one, this congresswoman that said she was in a Publix store, nice mid-end grocery store, and she was attacked by a white guy for no reason. It turned out that there was just a verbal argument. The guy was Cuban. He's a liberal Democrat, and he showed up at her press conference and called her out. But I mean, the Nikki Jolly house fire where a transgender man, quote unquote, in Michigan set their home on fire and killed these beautiful show dogs and claimed this was a bias crime. But there's so many of them, like Covington Catholic, Yasmin Saweed with the torn hijab. I will say Covington was an incident more than a crime. But like Air Force Academy, where a general went there and talked to the Black and white students about not fighting each other. It was just one maladjusted cadet who didn't like, all the hazing they do at those academies. Allegedly. But I mean,
I'm curious though, let's visit that just for a second. What is that general to do? I sit there and I think about it, and being in a command, it's like, okay, you have something that happened at an institution that's representing you. It is getting national press. You either ignore it or wait until the facts are in, and you answer, well, we need to wait till all the facts are in. Or do you go and just make a statement and say, hey, this is not acceptable behavior, and try to make it a teaching moment? I'm curious, how do you handle that in the best way possible?
As a leader, personally, I would wait until all the facts are in, because in whatever, say it's just 40%, but in many of these high profile cases, specifically, these things have turned out not to be real. So let me say, what I would probably do is issue a statement saying, crime of whatever sort, sexual assault, is never acceptable. while we work to get all the facts and we pray that no one protests, etc., until we get all the facts, we stand by the claims of, Samia Shakur, or whatever the student's name might happen to be. What I would certainly not do, so I'd issue a statement, I'd be polite. I don't think I'd go there and make a speech so good that people would consider suggesting I run for Congress. I certainly don't think that I would, in response to an allegation, not a proven incident, offer benefits to the group making the allegation, because that way you're just kind of feeding the beast. I mean, this is one of the things you see all the time on these college campuses. There was one guy who in hate crime hoax, who went to a school in Columbus, and I frankly forget the name of the school, but he, within 3 years, perpetrated 4 of these hoax incidents.
Oh, good.
And the reason was that the campus kept
career.
Well, as I recall, he got additional financial aid one year. The campus held a solidarity march through campus for him. We all stand with our black students. So these big fraternity guys were escorting him and asking him to parties, black and white fraternities, as I recall. I mean, just on and on and on. And this went on a couple more times until a detective finally just asked him for a handwriting sample. Like, this keeps happening. Let's see if we can get the handwriting of the guy who keeps leaving these notes pasted to your bedroom windows and so on. And the guy had a panic attack and confessed everything. So, I mean, but this is not infrequent and actually this is something, by the way, that people on the fringe on both left and right, without doing a lot of team player stuff, have learned to do, where you see the ubiquitous GoFundMe almost as soon as anything allegedly happens. Like, the Antifa community in Portland suffered a terrifying attack by Proud Boys yesterday. Although no one was killed, we need to repair 4 expensive European bicycles. Please give here. And at the collegiate level, it gets a little more professional, where student activists might demand, for example, a cultural competence center or a visit to campus from Bell Hooks or Umar Johnson or something, which costs about $30,000, Ibram Kendi, in exchange for dropping some of a list of demands. And if I were a college president, I've learned to work on my tact since leaving the legal world and the sales floors. I wouldn't just say, like, get the hell out of here, I'll expel you. But I mean, you would definitely say, well, let's wait until this case is resolved to see, in fact, if we do have a problem with serious demonstrated racism on campus. Where that doesn't happen, what you often see is that the case was proven to be a fake, but the Cultural Competence Center or Young Men's Diversity Institute or whatever was built anyway.
So I was like, kind of win. Let me get to a little bit on the chats here, just to make sure I get them covered. I've been neglectful and hogging. From Eva, what is the distribution and most popular type of hate crime hoaxes Dr. Reilly is aware of?
Well, there are quite a few interesting patterns in the data, actually. I mean, as I said, in both my data and on, again, they're websites that are run by pretty professional people like Laird Wilcox, the extremism researcher, that have been tracking these for a while. I mean, fakehatecrimes.org also has 600-700 cases. Yeah, it's an interesting site. It's a well-maintained resource. But I mean, in both my data set and his teams, I guess, I'm sure he has research assistants and so on. I mean, what you find is that a third or more of these cases take place in specifically academic environments. And again, that's an astonishing overrepresentation. If, half of 1% of Americans are currently going to, an accredited 2 or 4 year college, and 36% of the cases take place there, I could be anywhere within 3% on that one. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. So, I mean, there are hundreds of these in academia in a typical year. And I mean, a lot of the cases, if you think about going back to Duke lacrosse, but like Drake University, Eastern Michigan, Kansas State, where there's this horrible racist graffiti spray painted on, a black student's late model car pretty recently. That's the most concentrated forum for these. And you see some other interesting trends in the data. Muslim Americans were actually very likely to report false hate incidents as opposed to either blacks or whites. And
is that tied to 9/11?
Probably. I mean, so we tend to think of the most oppressed group in the United States as African Americans. Some would
argue Jews.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. Like Jews are the most overrepresented group by far among real hate crime incidents. And there are also but there also are some false hate crime incidents that come out of the Jewish community. So, I mean, but what I was going to say about the idea of black people are the most oppressed people, that's not really accurate. I mean, if you look at just incomes by group in the USA, I mean, African Americans per household are $10,000 or so ahead of Mexican Americans, actually moving a little toward catching up with whites, despite the fact we have much smaller households because of the wave of single motherhood. And similarly here, when it comes to the people most likely to think racism is everywhere, I personally feel like college environments are doing black students a real disservice by just repeating that over and over and over to every black kid. But probably since 9/11, the group most likely to report racial bias from some surveys I've seen is Arab Americans, Muslim Americans. So in addition to honestly reporting some of these cases, you probably do recognize, well, this is something I could say to get some attention or to get some notoriety. And I mean,
I was going to say also to be sympathetic, I do feel that immediately after 9/11, at least for a few years, people were looking a little bit askance at anybody who looked like they could be Middle Eastern. And while they may not have done something directly, maybe some of them just kind of felt it all the time and did this to draw that attention at all.
well,
I don't know. I'm trying to be, sympathetic to it.
Well, I mean, I'm actually not that sympathetic. I mean, like I've experienced mild racism as a black guy. My white buddies don't get affirmative action benefits. Like life sometimes sucks. Women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence than men by far. That doesn't mean you can just make up felonies. So, I mean, right. Again, to the extent that we have law, which is to some extent outside of some basic 10 Commandments level things just made up, but to the extent we have law, I think it's reasonable to expect, adult warrior class citizens to obey it. So there's not too much else I can say about that. I mean, yeah, there probably is some desire to lash back at what seems to be a subtly racist society for Muslim Americans. But nonetheless, if you go to that point where you're claiming, a white campus rival is attempting to kill you, I mean, that's not cool.
Obviously evil too. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I do think that it's tempting with Muslim Americans. At least I can see your point, like post 9/11 Arab Americans.
Immediately after, it was really, I don't know. I'm just kind of that one. And I could see a lot of mistaken things too. Like, if you accidentally bump somebody and, like somebody in the store and knocked their hijab off or scuffled with it, they might interpret it as such more likely. Yeah. And in fairness, let me see. Luke is saying young mammals evolved to present their weaknesses to gather sympathy and more care. This is the same strategy.
Yeah, I actually think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, one thing that's become kind of a cliche in sort of conservative or center-right business circles is that we've given a lot of power to victimization. But at the most basic level, that's true. I mean, you can sue someone for a dozen years worth of their income by claiming that you have been victimized under what are now a whole suite of civil rights laws. I mean, the original Civil Rights Act, but also the Americans with Disabilities Act, the many revised versions of that, laws pertaining to age discrimination, Voting Rights Act. So, I mean, to some extent, if you can claim that you possess a victim status, that's worth a fair amount of money, and that gives you a decent amount of power and prominence. And I mean, this is very definitely true in higher education. I mean, one of the things that's kind of remarkable to me is how rarely massive institutional affirmative action is brought up as a counterweight to claims of white privilege. So, like, as a black business guy, I certainly don't feel whites are oppressed. I mean, we don't need to start hearing nonsense from the other side of the track now. But I mean, it's we're all countrymen, brother. But I mean, I do.
Hold on, I got this comment here. I have to bring it up though.
You both look white. Well, it's I haven't been tanning lately. But I mean. And that's another thing. I mean, racial categories to some extent are invented. But I mean, so like in my background, when I take a DNA test, I'm like 40% West African Bantu, 40% Irish. And
I've actually read somewhere that Kenyans are closer to Europeans than they are Nigerians.
That's correct.
Get into the DNA breakdown or some variant of that.
Yeah, well,
interesting.
Well, but I mean, I think a lot of people use that to try to discredit the idea of race. I think it's accurate to say that the modern conception of race, which includes in an urban city school questions like, Are Irishmen and Italians white? I mean, that's pretty baseless. But at the same time, we actually know. I talked to some of the private genomics players like 23andMe for Taboo, although relatively briefly. But I mean, if you just Google 23andMe reference haplotype groups or 23andMe reference populations, there actually are about 50 identified human populations. There's 7 just in Africa. That's the most diverse continent, that break down to 6 or 7 primary large groups. And I don't really see any reason not to call those ethnicities and races. So like what you just said is basically just that East Africans are part Caucasian. So Nigeria,
we're all technically all Africans, technically.
Yeah. Well, not quite. I mean, I do definitely think that there's a separate European Caucasian group, which is distinguished by length of time in a cold climate and by what now looks like a 7 or 8% Neanderthal admixture. I actually first heard that from a black racist. We were talking about something.
I like it when it's even. I do.
No.
I appreciate that.
But me and this guy were talking about something. He was like, "You aggressive because you part caveman." And it was like, wow, that's pretty racist, bro. Like, what the hell are you talking about? He was like, well, all white people are, 3+% Neanderthal. And you can test this by using this technique. Like a lot of hoteps, this guy actually had a college degree, pretty educated guy. And I checked this out and it's true. So, I mean, definitely like 10,000 years worth of adaptation plus
Here's the hole in his theory, though. The Neanderthals were the peaceful ones that got killed.
Oh yeah, I don't necessarily think whites.
Oh, it's kind of like, well, okay, yeah, you're right, but then there's that other little problem. I think the hominoids or whatever pretty much wiped them out.
Yeah, we killed and ate them. I mean, looking at the bone fragments and so on. But I mean, first of all, I don't think Neanderthals were peaceful. I just think they weren't as well equipped to fight as we were.
Okay, well, weaker, whatever.
No, they were stronger. Like, so one of my things that I, during like a dorm room bull session would say 20 years ago, and I still believe, is that although there's very little sort of religious magic in the world, in my opinion, it certainly didn't help my native ancestors much against gunpowder. The great human legends do have real bases. So, I mean, I think Neanderthals were the inspiration for the troll concept. These creatures that were 6.5 to 7 feet tall, covered in fur, they might eat you too if they caught you, but they were slow. Preferred weapon was a club. I just don't think they had much of a chance against the people that were coming up from Africa with, recurved bows and atlatl javelins and so on. But I mean, so the point that I'm making isn't that whites or blacks are better, which is the definition of racism. It's just that I do think there are different racial categories. Like, it's not particularly hard to tell an East African from a West African. And it's certainly not particular. Like, just the last thing on race. If you were to take 100 people from one of the African powers that are rising, Ghana, and 100 Swedes and 100 Koreans, and take off all their clothes and put them in a room, and someone with no medical training was asked to distinguish them on the basis of genetic physical characteristics into racial groups, they would do so while making no mistakes at all. So I think that sometimes we get a little too clever with some of these definitions. Like the fact that the most Caucasian African group is closer to a Caucasian group than an African group doesn't mean there aren't West Africans. Like, I'm not especially racially proud, but I think those categories obviously exist. I also think that as we get more into private genomics, we'll be able to test some of like the classic stereotypes. I mean, I think most people subconsciously believe Asians are a little better on the scholastic end. African Americans are a little better on the physical end. Most people, if they're being honest, put these gaps at like 2 to 4%. I wouldn't be surprised if something like that turns out to be true. I also don't think that would matter very much for the individual at all. I mean, that would determine, for example, who, astronauts that best combine the two traits might be. But I do think we're going to look at more of that kind of thing. Like, are there genes? And I don't really think these would be particularly racial at all, but that predict intelligence. Like, can we identify 20 specific things that are allelic frequencies that show that this isn't just sort of a blank slate process? And I think
with Ashkenazi Jews, I think they've done some research that they're pretty high up in that area.
Well, yeah. So there are measured IQ differences between groups. Now, this is one of the taboos, to drop a book plug in there. I mean, a part of the book talks about these things you're not supposed to say about race. The intellectual. Are you the next
Charles Murray?
No, I actually disagree. First of all, I think Charles Murray is. If you've ever met Charles Murray, and I've seen him in passing at conferences and so on, we're not friends but
Right.
we're not enemies either. I don't know him. But I mean, Charles Murray seems to be, a quiet, pleasant social scientist. I think he's attracted a lot of anger simply because he has said the unsayable. And one thing that's an advantage for me, frankly, is that I'm a black dude. So I think it's a little harder to falsely allege that I'm a Nazi. But
you take advantage of that too. And I mentioned this off the air to Mike Wood last night, but he was very big with the left for a while. I mean, the Young Turks loved him. Everybody loved him and all that. And I was like, well, you were a cop who seemed to be anti-cop. And so were you, kind of tokenized a little bit. Do you feel that way with conservatives at all? That, oh, hey, you're black. Come on, man. Get over here. We want you to say this stuff.
Well, I think it's definitely something that some people might try to do. I guess the thing is, though, like there are a lot of people. And I mean, I guess if I had an intellectual affiliation, when you look at who I follow on Twitter, whose books I would read, it would be something like Intellectual Dark Web or Heterodox. So, I mean, I own books from Ben Shapiro, but also Sam Harris, Tom Sowell, Ian Hersey Ali, Brett Weinstein. I mean, I think there are a whole bunch of obviously highly intelligent people that don't have just one set of parameters they adhere to. And I actually think everyone I mentioned is a fairly famous intellectual, or at least pundit, because of that. I think people like to listen to a fairly honest voice. Like Shapiro's obviously on the right, Harris is obviously on the left. But I think
they make no bones about it. They're clear.
Yeah, and they also don't say nonsensical bullshit generally that just supports their own side's claims. Like, it's necessary we pass, X bill. I mean, I've heard both do it from time to time. But anyway, the point is, I'm not those guys, and I think they do a pretty good job. Just in general, I think being an honest speaker is good, and that's my goal. And I think I, to some extent, achieve that. I mean, the final chapter of Taboo is criticizing myths on the right, like the alt-right and the Q movement and so on. But definitely there are conservatives who would be more likely to say, yeah, this guy's original if you're a black guy who's from the business world, who's conservative about a bunch of things. But I mean, that's also true in reverse. I mean, if you look at, bluntly, if you look at a lot of the leading white liberal figures, they pretended to be minorities for years and were embraced by the minority community. I mean, Rachel Dolezal was the NAACP's chair in Washington. Elizabeth. Yeah, but someone just mentioned Sean King. Too good. But I mean, like, there have been some allegations that Sean King just happens to be, a Caucasian guy. Elizabeth Warren said that she was Native American.
Oh, good Lord. Whatever you think of Trump, he did a brilliant job trolling her into that test.
But no, I mean, it's the thing with Elizabeth Warren. I actually, when I gave speeches and so on, laid off her for years. I was like, she can't have really claimed this. This is bullshit. We know there are a lot of good trolls on the GOP side. No, she actually did. Like, Jane Lingle, my research associate, did a deep dive on this. Like, she contributed to a book called Pow Wow Chow, like, for years running.
Benefits specifically from it.
Yeah.
And that's evil.
But yeah, I think that, by the way, so I guess just quick point here first. I think obviously if you're a white liberal or a black conservative, there are going to be people across the racial and political aisle that are going to be more quick to embrace you. And other than personal honesty and ethics, so on, I don't really know a way to get around that. The one thing that I won't do is change what I believe dramatically to try to grow an audience, because I think in the end that would be self-defeating. Like, I've talked to people like literary agents that have basically said, okay, you've got to market as like witty center-right dude in a suit. People tend to respect your scholarship, which is okay, whether or not it sells books. But I mean, if you just were to go full MAGA for like a month, I could get you booked at CPAC. Like, we could sell 100,000 copies. And it's just like, nah, because then I'd have to go back to campus and people would wonder if I'd gone insane. I mean, there'd be a lot of questions that would go along with being, someone other than yourself. So be real. But yes, of course, people embrace real people that they think side with them. And that can sometimes shade into unreality. Oh, final thing, by the way, when you said it's evil to take those benefits undeservedly, I can't believe someone would do that. I personally tend to think that's extraordinarily common.
I'm not saying it's uncommon. I just said it's evil.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I don't disagree.
And evil is common. So, okay.
Oh, good. Well, point to you, actually. Good line. But no, I mean, I think that a lot of people don't understand how that process works. And now, obviously, we are not encouraging people to do this. Like, you do have a 1 in 10 chance of getting caught and you'll be a scumbag whether you do or not. But if you apply to a university and you list your race, if you check native and just on top of it write part, no one's going to check. So, I mean, I would assume that the percentage of people that are claiming affiliations outside of the white category in academia or even in Fortune 500 businesses quite high. And I think that based on some semi-anonymous tests I've asked among ambitious young faculty members and so on, I have no doubt this is the case. I mean, you can obviously say you're part Native American. You can say you're Hispanic and be fully Caucasian. We just saw a case where an unambitious young academic actually kind of came undone for doing this because they'd just taken it too far. They started referring to themselves as like a sassy Latina in their Twitter bio and posting.
There's Alec Baldwin's wife is, I guess, under fire for not being Spanish. But isn't that how everything unravels? I mean, every con person, it starts with one little, just one little smudge. Let's just push it a little bit. And
first of all,
goes.
Well, bluntly, I don't think most people are caught for crimes. I mean, this is something I don't think that Trump is correct about the election being stolen from him. I think that's crazy, just to get that out there. But when you talk about voter fraud, my mom was a union teacher in Chicago in the 90s. And I can tell you voter fraud is not at a zero baseline. There's
always voter fraud. It's a matter of how much.
Well, but that's the thing. And I don't know how much, and I'm not going to speculate and pull numbers out of my ass, frankly. But I mean, if we're talking honestly about this, when people say, well, only 69 people last year, whatever the number might be, were arrested for voter fraud, they're overlooking a glaring problem, which is that you don't need an ID to vote. In about half the states, all you need to do is know somebody's name. So there's virtually no way. And I mean, in Chicago, like the name could be O'Malley or Rodriguez, so there's virtually no way anyone would get caught for this. A similar point, I mean, I'm way past the point in my life where I can pull out a pirated movie on a date and have that be okay. But the Cyrillic subtitles at the bottom and so on. But I mean, I recently, as part of a cybersecurity class that I teach, went to the old Pirate Bay website, which is back up as piratebay.org. And
we refer to that as going to Sweden for content.
Yeah. Went to the Europeans. But I mean, so the reason I mentioned this is that as part of teaching the class, I had mentioned that there were 75 arrests, about the same as the number for voter fraud, in the most recent year on record, which is 2018, for internet piracy. And my students were making jokes like, I mean, there must be 26 people in this class. And when I actually checked out Pirate Bay, there were 31 million, I believe, users active on the site at that point. So again, I don't think that the majority of people who do something like fake an ethnic identity and then move are ever caught for that at all. But yeah, Hilaria Baldwin
became kind of perfectly.
Yeah, well, it turns out she's from South Boston, right? Like, she was a Boston Irish chick.
Right.
So I don't even know whether she'd been trying to claim the added cachet of social class with that or something. But with her, it was pretty noticeable because she kept slipping between like Spanish, General American, and like Southie accents. And this had been caught on the record all the time during things like cooking shows.
Different than Madonna when she turned British for a while, remember?
Yeah.
I mean, I actually was kind of amused by it. Everybody's like, oh my God. And before we get off the ethnicity, I have to, Dr. Wood is actually here. And now he wants to debate you on the ethnicity and race and constructs. So,
well, I mean, I think we'll probably debate offline as opposed to, exchanging comments and so on. But like, just one thing about that, I do think, and I obviously respect his opinions, intelligent ones, but I think debates about this can become a little semantic. So, I mean, when I talk to 23andMe and the equivalents, the term they use would be generally something like haplotypic population. There's really no doubt that there are West Africans, which in that region would be referred to as Bantu or Bantu Africans, that have certain characteristics at probably a higher frequency than members of other groups. If you want to talk about East Africans, I mean, as I recall, as of last year, the 27 best marathon times in the world were held by someone that was either a Kikuyu Kenyan, a Kalenjin Kenyan.
With that, though, there's a problem because I'm fat right now, but I actually have done marathons within the past few years. There's a real drug issue.
Oh yeah. But
And it's screwing with the numbers, and it's like, okay, yeah, everybody's coming from Kenya, we're all worshiping it, blah 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 blah. But when every damn one of them keeps popping, you kind of go.
well,
and here's the problem with the drugs, and now I'm hijacking the conversation, but I got to get this one out. The drugs that are being used are not helping during a race. People think of steroids and things like that as, oh, you take it, you're on steroids, you run really fast, but that's not what they do.
No.
What they do is they let you overtrain.
Yep.
And you're overtraining, and steroids themselves reduce swelling, things like that. So then that way you can pump more weight, and you recover faster. And then you're perfectly clear when you go do the race.
Yep.
Same thing with the other factor, if you will. So it's really hard to catch it. And then you have to depend on the government to actually test it. There's a great thing on Russia and what they did.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a quick response to that, though, which is that the second best sets of times come from Ethiopian and Moroccan men, and those countries actually have pretty solid drug testing programs. So, like, I'm not a racist, to be very simple. Like, if there exist small genetic differences between groups, I don't think that comes anywhere close to the genetic variance between groups, for example. But I do think that you can see, so race, if you want to use that term, and culture and training, which is more important, and a number of other things, including racism
and diet. By the way,
diet. I'd put that as part of culture. But all those things play a role. But I mean, so what you would see if you had both a cultural and a quote unquote genetic variable is that the East African guys that were cheating would have the best times, and then the East African guys that were not cheating would have the second best set of times. And then probably, actually, if you look at body types and slow twitch muscle fibers, whites, specifically Northern European Caucasians, would have the next best set of times. And this would be for long distance running, and you'd see the paradigm almost reversed for sprinting. And in fact,
Jamaicans and West Africans are definitely much more fast twitch. And by the way, that is DNA oriented, and that's been proven.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Like, if you follow some of the stuff that's been written about sports, which I do, I was a passable athlete. In fact, distance running was one of my sports. So I'm clearly not like the guy most built for it. But I mean, like, I remember as a high school athlete back in like 2000 reading Etine, Etine. The book's actually called Taboo, but it looks at genetic differences and cultural and training differences between groups, as well as drug use and how all these things predict athletic performance. And there are a lot of pretty dramatic group differences. Of the 100 best 100-meter sprint times, I think it's 91, you might correct me, are held by males of West African descent, like recent West African Bantu descent. That could be Nigerian, it could be Black American, it could be Jamaican. The rest, I would assume, would be white guys, just using that sort of crude race plus training stereotyping we broke out. None are East African, none are ever Asian. Of the 100 best swim times, I believe all of them are held by Caucasians, again, males. So, like, you could assume that there's definitely a sex and very possibly a race, quote unquote, effect there. None of this means much of anything if you are not an Olympic athlete. I mean, I was a fairly good swimmer in high school, and I'm black.
There's another issue, too, that I hate to throw in the wild card. But, like, you know, everybody's like, why are all this, you know, world-class sprinters out of Jamaica? Well, because that's what they do in Jamaica. And the truth is, there are American blacks who are probably equal that or faster.
Yep.
What are they doing? They play for the NFL for a whole lot of money.
Yep.
So that kind of, a lot of these factors get thrown in. And one more point on the East Africans is environment.
Oh, yeah.
I forgot to mention it, but that is incredibly significant because where they live, you know, it's live high, train low. They literally have adapted because of the location where they live to get their oxygen levels to where it's like they're doping naturally.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think all this comes into play. So race is not, to me, and by the way, when you asked if have any interest in being like the next Charles Murray, not really. I'm actually
I was being facetious.
Oh, no.
He's got nothing more than, he's got so much garbage for one page out of a pretty fat book.
No, but I mean, like, first of all, like, am I good enough to do that? He's like a top 10 social scientist. Two, we research different things. But what I'm saying there is that I'm primarily a culturalist when it comes to group performance. I actually would be really willing to talk to you or Dr. Wood or anyone down the road about, my take on race. Is haplotype race? It's a good conversation. But I mean, I think there's no way of getting around the fact that obviously cultural and training variables matter more. So like if you look at IQ, well, even if you want to look at running, when I was on the men's varsity track team for my high school, everyone ran the mile between one guy, I think two guys were under 5, everyone was under 6, but within a 1 minute range, which is huge if you're talking about a race. That's the difference between the first guy and the last guy.
Sure.
But the average mile time, I remember reading when I was in high school, is about 11 minutes. It's considered a triumph to train soldiers down to the point where they're running, 2 miles, and it's like 1.5 miles in 12 now. So the training that you would use to become part of a competent varsity track team would put you in the top 0.5% of all untrained humans. That's the whole point of the training. And we find, and we find this to be true with pretty much everything. So like, sure, does it help that the Kalenjin region of Kenya is a tabletop that's 10,000 feet in the sky and people run up there? Yeah. At the same time, I would assume that elite Japanese and American athletes have the chance to go there and would be welcome.
They do. I think the other part is really back to the cultural thing of they need it. It's not only where they live, but it's also their diet. That's significant too. Every element of it, they spend their whole lives running barefoot to school.
Yeah.
I mean, cultural, every part of it, and they're not going to do anything else. Now, if most of them could choose, they would probably be something else anyway, but that's their outlet. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them, and a handful of them become world champions.
Of course. Just like there are thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans, and very few of us make it to the NBA. But we make up 80% of the NBA. Sure. Because the physical characteristics, to the extent that race matters, of most of the groups here, West Africans, Northern Europeans, are pretty well suited to basketball. Filipinos are a great people, some of my best friends, but probably would not be as effective at the sport of basketball because the average height. They are beasts at soccer because they're on average, not each individual, but strong and small. But if the average Pinoy man is 5'6", and the average Nordic guy is 6'4", you can call that race or not. Haplotype is more scientifically accurate, but the second group's going to be better at basketball. Like, this is not really, it has nothing to do with the moral worth of these people. But I mean, again, my point, when it comes to a lot of things, like, I think the racial argument for IQ differences is actually extremely weak for scientific reasons.
Well, there's the Flynn effect too, which screws it all up.
Well, but that in and of itself illustrates the power of culture. I mean, if you were to peg, if you were to peg racial or regional differences in the USA, like North, South, Black, White, at 10 points, just splitting some of the different estimates out there, the Flynn effect has moved average IQ in the USA up 22 points since about 1935. And by that point, we were using fully mathematical, fairly modern tests. So the effect of what has to be culture, like sending girls to school, is 2 or more times the size of the gap that's often used to argue for white-black differences or that Southerners are dumb or anything like that. And what that strongly implies to me is that, once again, the training variable here, I don't think people have brains of dramatically different sizes or whatever. That's literally phrenology. I think the training variable is a pretty large, very, very large chunk of what we're doing here. And this evidence keeps coming up. One of the things that's kind of interesting, actually, is that any discussion of racial differences in terms of, for example, tested IQ has become so taboo that this is blocking some good news from getting out.
That's true. I mean, I do feel like we're crippled in the conversation, and I'm like, oh shit. There's automatically a cringe factor, and we're not free to speak openly. And that is a problem, because it's like there are differences between all of us culturally, whatever speaking. Well, why not acknowledge it and say, oh, well, you know what? Where I grew up, we do this.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of my major points. Adjusting for most of these cultural variables in areas which are not wholly pure body physical eliminates most, if not all, of most gaps. But what's become popular on the censorious kind of center left is denying almost that there are gaps at all. Or if they must be due to racism. And I mean, like, a lot of this stuff, like Thomas Sowell recently wrote a book called Charter Schools and Their Enemies. And in the book, just in passing, is one of the most astonishing findings I've seen, where he looks at the SAT scores. I believe SAT could be NAEP scores, but the SAT scores for people that go to good charter schools, like Success Academy in New York. And then for identical kids, i.e. they entered the same lottery to go to the same school in the same borough, that were rejected, that didn't get the additional cultural training, like study time games, matrix analysis, so on. And what he finds is that the kids who go to the charter schools score about 200 points higher on the test. Like identical kids, same race. The second group of kids did okay on the test, but the gap is between like 940 and almost 1200.
Well, those charter kids are doing better than the quote white kids.
Yes. Yeah. This again is one of those just astonishing things. I mean, and in our culture, we have such a pattern of lying on all sides in terms of advancing political positions that big data is sometimes almost lost in the mix. So for years, I thought that charter school kids only did a point or two better than public school kids overall. And that's true. But the difference is that as you probably know, is that the public school population is still large majority white and Asian. But the charter school population is 95% Black and Hispanic, or whatever it is, 92% in some states. So essentially, we know how to get minority kids to the same scores as at least white kids. Asians still do a bit better for complex reasons. But I mean, we know how to do this. We're just not doing it. And all of the nonsense about racism and so on is just not always nonsense, but it doesn't matter. We know how to get the same scores. Anything but doing that is a waste of time.
Good news, though. De Blasio is working on shutting those damn schools down so we can get things back to normal.
Well, one of the most that fucking guy. Excuse me, but like one of the most ridiculous stories I've seen in a long time actually came out of New York and involved charters. And it was one of those things that you had to read like you were reading Pravda. So, I mean, the New York Times and a couple of the New York sectional papers started looking at the charter, not even the charter academies, like all the selectives, charters, magnets, so on in the city. And what they found, the way it was reported is in elite schools like Bronx Science, white kids are 14 times more likely to be in the student body than Black kids. It would be like 2% Black kids and 28% white kids. What all of these stories left out was that all of these schools are like 65% Asian. So people were literally just comparing the white number and the Black number and saying this white racism has to stop. But the huge majority of the people in every one of the schools were Chinese. I mean, like second generation immigrant hip hop kids. I'm sorry?
Harvard seems to note it, and they're pushing the Asians out.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I recently talked with the Brown Pundits podcast. It's a great podcast out of India. And one of the guys was talking and said, if Americans are going to do all this diversity stuff, what they should do is what we do in India, which is have what are called open reservations. So you just say, like, we have a history of race and class war. We're going to apologize for it. And so for 50 years, we're going to make 14% of the slots Black people. And then an elite job would hire the best Black guys they could find for those 14% of the slots. And I think that at least would be honest and upfront. What Harvard apparently, and by the way, I oppose that. I'd just say everyone go compete. There are hundreds of things, being gay, that affect your life and how you might be perceived. But I mean, what Harvard's apparently done is kind of anything but that, where they obviously have a cap. I would put it at about 15% for Asians, just offhand. But they use all kind of trickery to keep Asians below that level. Like the most offensive example was there's a spoken verbal portion of each Harvard interview, each application process. And it turned out in court paperwork that Harvard admissions officers were ranking Asians staggeringly low on characteristics like friendliness and leadership. And they were doing so to the exact extent they would compensate for their higher SAT scores. So with Blacks, on the other hand, it seemed to be assumed that we were kind of dumb but we were friendly and we were good leaders on the ball
Good
field.
Lord.
So like a black kid, this stuff, this is just
that's racism, man. Full out every which way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the scores though really were like something you'd see if a school were like interviewing Jewish kids in the 40s. It would be like black guy, test score 20th percentile of the group applying to Harvard, friendliness score 100th percentile of the group applying to Harvard, Asian kid, test score 80%, leadership score 25th percentile. So I think they've been told to stop doing that, but I frankly don't know. I mean, and again, if you're going to do something other than open competition, that's probably the worst way to do it.
Right. Well, you know what? On that note, we're well past that hour. We've boiled the ocean a little bit, but we have a lot more to go. I'm hoping you'll come back, and maybe we'll bring Dr. Wood on. You guys can hash it out. I don't know.
Yeah, I'd be more than willing to talk about it. As I said, I think a lot of the debate here is somewhat semantic. I mean, I do think it's pretty obvious that groups, blacks and whites, for example, vary in characteristics like skin color, hair texture. The question is whether these regional haplotypic populations vary in terms of other things that matter more. My answer would probably be a little bit, but as you mentioned, living on top of a mountain is also an advantage if you're trying to do some distance running. So that's I tend to be more on the culturalist side of that.
Well, fantastic. Now, folks, grab both his books, Hate, Crime, Hoax, and essentially something about the left, and Taboo, or Things You Can't Talk About. And I feel like we kind of covered both a little bit as we went back and forth. And this has been a delight, man. Now, people can find you as Will_the_beast on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm the simplest way to look for me actually would just be to Google Wilfred Reilly or go on Bing or any similar engine. I mean, you'll find my, academic campus site, my Twitter, Facebook, and so on. And I'm very receptive to kind of meeting and chopping it up with people. So you always hesitate to give a final line like, well, buy my book and check me out online. But essentially that's what I'm saying.
To buy his book. And I gotta give my line. If you're not already subscribed, what's wrong with you? Please subscribe. I do need it. It helps me get people like Will to actually come to the show. He'll be like, I don't know, does this guy have enough going on here? So please do. And Will, thank you so much, man.